Today I'm going to be replacing the wheel seal, the spindle bearing, and the spindle bearing seals. This is a 94 Bronco. This will apply to late model Ford trucks with a Dana 44 TTB. The seals for the later model trucks are a different style from the earlier models, so we need to make sure that the parts are the correct ones. These are all the correct parts for a late model vehicle. This is the inner spindle bearing seal. This is the outer spindle bearing seal. It's a plastic ring and it's got a metal piece, and then inside is the rubber seal and it's got a garter spring around it. The spindle bearing and wheel seal are the same as the early model years. An easy way to determine if you have the early model style seals or late model style seals is the early models will have a metal flange right here, and that's how you can tell if it's an early or late model. You will need some special tools for this. You'll need a spindle locknut tool. You need the kind with the teeth that stick out. You need a slide hammer with the 3-jaw puller attachment, a 4-wheel drive spindle puller that will fit the slide hammer, a bearing, race, and seal driver kit, a pair of snap ring pliers, and a 6mm 12-point socket. This one's a 3/8 inch drive, but I recommend you get a 1/4 inch drive because it'll fit much better into the space where you need to get it into to get the bolts off. A few other things you'll need is some brake cleaner, some grease. You need to make sure it's high temperature disc brake grease, shop towels or clean rags, and a clean space to put all these parts. I'm starting with the truck already up on jack stands. The wheel and brake caliper and pads are already removed. I'll put a link to the video where I show how to do that. First step is to remove these 6 screws that hold the cap on. Set those aside. Safe place. Just pull the cap. Shouldn't take too much effort. Set that aside. Now you'll need a Phillips head screwdriver. Remove this screw right here. You need to hold on to this piece when you do, otherwise it'll come flying out because it's spring loaded. Put the screw in a safe place. Remove the lock thingy and the spring. And take your snap ring pliers. Remove the snap ring from the axle shaft. Now here's the tricky part. There's a inner snap ring in here. It doesn't have any holes or anything. Some people use a pick to get those out. What I like to use is 2 small screwdrivers. Use one screwdriver to pop it out of the groove, and use the other one to pop it outward. It may take a couple tries. Nobody likes these ones. There you go. Get that out. Now use 1 or 2 of the cap screws. Thread it back into the hub body and pull the hub body out. Now take the spindle lock nut tool. Loosen lock nut. It tends to click like that, so it's not something you need to worry about. Sometimes the lock nut doesn't come out in one piece. It'll come apart in 2 pieces. If that happens, it's not a big deal. Just take a small pair of pliers, pull the first piece out, and then pull the second piece out and just put them back together. Once you have them out, they just slide into each other. You can see mine came apart a bit. Okay, now I'm going to remove the hub and rotor assembly. The outer bearing will fall out when you do this, so if you plan on reusing it like I am, I like to put some tape on there to make sure it doesn't fall out onto the ground and damage it. I'm just going to lift it up and carefully slide it off the spindle. And make sure you set it down on a clean area. I've got a rag right over here waiting for it. Wiping excess grease off the spindle. Wrap the spindle with a rag or a shop towel to keep it from being damaged. Take my gloves off now. Okay, now I need to remove the ABS sensor. Unbolt it. It's got a 8mm bolt holding it on to the back side of the knuckle. Now pull it out. If it is stuck, you can use a appropriately sized socket and just very lightly tap it until it comes out. So mine's loose, so I'll pull it out. Just like that. Set it up there somewhere. Okay, now to take off the ABS sensor shield. That is what the 6mm socket is for. Make sure you use a 12.6mm socket when you do this. Use a 18mm socket and a breaker bar to break these spindle nuts free. When you're doing this, you want to be careful not to damage the spindle, because that would not be good. Now we're going to use the slide hammer to get that off. Take your 4-wheel drive spindle puller. I like to keep the spindle covered as much as possible. And very, very carefully thread it on. If it doesn't go on easily, don't try to force it, because you don't want to ruin those threads. Okay, now that that's on, take the slide hammer. It can be a bit awkward doing this sometimes. And thread it in. It may take a couple good tries with the slide hammer if yours haven't been removed. Mine have, so they aren't going to be that hard to get off, but just give it a few shots. Should come off fairly easily. Okay, now pull the spindle off. The axle shaft may try to come out with the spindle. If it does, it's not a big deal. Pull it off. Have a spot waiting for it so it's clean, and wrap the axle shaft, mainly this part, because that part rides on the spindle bearing. Wrap all that up in a rag so that it doesn't get damaged or excessively dirty. Alright, now it's time to pull the spindle bearing and spindle bearing seal. This little metal flange right here is part of the spindle bearing seal. Directly below it, pressed into here, is the spindle bearing itself. Now, when you do this, you want to make sure you have a rag down to put the spindle on. It's very important because you do not want to damage the threads on the end of the spindle, or you could potentially be looking at buying a new spindle, and that would not be fun. Okay, now we're going to set up the 3-jaw puller. Another awkward task. You want to make sure that the teeth are right under the spindle bearing. Make sure that they're not going to skip over the spindle bearing. Alright, it doesn't have to be too tight. Just make sure that it's not going to slide off. Now, good couple hits with a slide hammer should pull it right out. Alright, and there is the spindle bearing and spindle bearing seal. I'm cleaning out the spindle, wipe all that old grease out. Got all the old grease out of there, and you want to take just a little tiny bit of new grease. Just put a tiny layer, just a little bit where the spindle bearing will sit. I'll take the spindle bearing, wipe all the stuff off of it because it comes with stuff to keep it from rusting. Okay, you want to make sure that you seat it with the part with the numbers on it facing upward, and that's also the flatter part. Just place that right there. Now I need to select an appropriate sized driver. Now I like to use a rubber mallet because it should pose less of a risk of driving it in crooked. You want to make sure you drive it in absolutely straight. There's a small ridge that the spindle bearing will bottom out against. You want to go until you hit that ridge. When you do, it should leave just enough space for the spindle bearing seal to be driven in after it. So on the next smallest size puller, you can see it's just about just the right size. Okay, looks like that should be good. Now I'll take the seal and find one that matches this lip because that's what's going to be driving it in. Make sure it is straight, tap it in. Make sure it's seated all the way, and there we go. The new spindle bearing and seal are driven in. Cover this up with a rag to make sure that no contaminants get into it. And we put on the other seal.